All right, these are the answers to our quiz review worksheet. First one, we see 1 plus cotangent squared. So right away, we're going to look at our formula sheet and see that that's cosecant squared. So we'll make that change. Then we'll go ahead and switch these over to sine and cosine. So cosecant squared is 1 over sine squared. Secant squared is 1 over cosine squared. Okay. So when I bring this up, I'm going to flip it. It's going to create cosine squared over 1 times the 1 over sine squared. So again, we're going to have this 1 over sine squared is going to stay up here. This is going to come up and flip and create this here. So when we multiply, we get cosine squared over sine squared. And I think that's fine. Or if you want to write that as cotangent squared, that'd be okay too. So I think either of these two would be acceptable. For number 2, we've got, there's no squareds plus ones or anything, so we can't go that route. So I'm just going to take that tangent, write that as sine over cosine. And on the bottom, we have secant, which is 1 over cosine times sine. Okay? So this bottom here turns into sine over cosine. We're going to bring that up and flip it. So we have the sine over cosine from the top, right, from the tangent, times, and then this flipped over, cosine over sine. These cancel, and we get 1. And again, we can do this canceling because it's multiplying. If that had been plus, we'd need a common denominator and do all that other stuff. But with multiplying, we can go ahead and do that kind of canceling there. Okay. For number 3, we've got sine squared minus 1. Now that one's you got to be a little careful about. The trig formula that we're going to be working with is sine squared plus cosine squared equals 1. So if you want to create this, you have to subtract 1 from both sides, but you also have to subtract cosine squared, which means sine squared minus 1 is equal to negative cosine squared. You'd have to subtract away this cosine squared and bring it over here, okay? And so that gets rid of it from this side. The minus 1 gets rid of it from this side, so you can see that you have sine squared minus 1 equals the cosine squared there. All right, so that's a little sneaky. You got to be careful there. Tangent squared plus 1, that's equal to secant squared. Secant squared is 1 over cosine squared. So now we have cosine squared or cosine squared. When these cancel, this negative then stays, and we end up with negative 1 as our answer for that. For number 4, we have secant squared minus tangent squared. If I go and look at that, that's equal to 1. So I can make a quick replacement there. And then I have cosine A times tangent, which is sine over cosine. So these cosines can cancel. So we end up with 1 over sine. And if you left that, that'd be fine, or you can write that as cosecant. One way or the other, I think those are both probably the same. Okay? So there's the first page. Then the second page, or the back page here, was trying to verify, so we know where we're trying to head with these. We just need to make it happen. So right away I see 1 minus cosine squared. I know that that's equal to sine squared. So I'll make that sine squared real quick. So that's where I'm trying to get this to head to. The tangent on top is sine over cosine. That's multiplying the cosine over cosecant, which is 1 over sine. Okay. So right away I see that these cosines will cancel. That's great. So now I'm going to have sine over 1 over sine. And when this comes up, it's going to flip. And so you're going to get sine times sine over 1, which is sine squared. And that's what we want right there. As soon as we have that agreement, then we can finish that. Over here, I've got sine times tangent equals secant minus cosine. So I'll just work on this real quick. We've got sine theta times sine over cosine. When I multiply, I'm going to get sine times sine, which is sine squared theta over cosine theta. And that's about as far as we're going to be able to go. It's all in terms of sine and cosine. I think we're just going to stop there and see what we can do on this other side. So secant is 1 over cosine minus cosine. All right, so you can see we don't have a common denominator, so we need that common denominator, and the common denominator is going to be cosine times 1, or just cosine. So I'm going to have, I'm going to leave that as cosine. And over here, in order to make this denominator cosine, I need to multiply both top and bottom by cosine. That's going to create cosine squared over cosine. Okay. Notice if I canceled, I'd get right back to what I had, which I'm not going to cancel, but that's important to know that you didn't change the value here. When we put this together, we have that common denominator, cosine, and on top we have 1 minus cosine squared. And we know that 1 minus cosine squared is sine squared. And so there's our agreement, and we verified that trig identity. For number 7, it certainly looks like this side's the more challenging one, so we'll go ahead and work on that. I've got cosine plus sine times tangent, which is sine over cosine. Okay, so if I multiply here, I'm going to get sine squared over cosine plus cosine. And I need a common denominator, which is going to be cosine here. So I'm going to multiply top and bottom by cosine x. That's going to create cosine squared over cosine plus sine squared over cosine. And if we put that together now, we'll have the common denominator cosine x. On the top, we're going to have cosine squared plus sine squared, which we know is equal to 1. 1 over cosine is secant, and that's exactly what we want. Okay. Again, it doesn't matter what, if you had changed that into 1 over cosine and then kind of drew your arrow, that's fine. As long as this side and that side are saying the same thing, that's what we want. All right, over here, I got sine times this. I'm going to distribute that. All right, and we'll then have sine of lambda times cosecant, which is 1 over sine, minus sine times sine, which is sine squared. Okay, these cancel, and so we get 1 minus sine squared, which is cosine squared. All right, so we kind of know where we're heading here then. We want this to turn into cosine squared. So we'll change that tangent into sine over cosine. This cosecant will change into 1 over sine. And the secant cubed on the bottom will become 1 over cosine cubed. All right. So right away you can see that these signs are going to cancel. When this comes up, it's going to flip. So we're going to have 1 over cosine. This is kind of gone, times this cosine to the third, which flipped over. And so this cosine cancels one of those 3 cosines, leaves us with 2 left, cosine squared, and that's what we want.